They said intuition isn't math, until a janitor taught math how to breathe. Rain stretched across the campus that morning like a silver thread stitching every path with cold. The stone floors of the Applied Sciences wing glistened under the last sweep of a mop. Somewhere above, the clock struck 8, each chime echoing through corridors lined with posters of brilliant minds and unsolved problems. Walter Kane was not a man who believed in fate. He believed in proofs, in peer-reviewed journals, in the elegant certainty that mathematics offered to those disciplined enough to hold it. But that morning, he was late. His shoes freshly polished, his coffee lukewarm and bitter, his mind tangled in the stubborn snarl of a problem that had haunted his department for 3 years. He did not see the thin streak of water left drying on the tiles. No one did, except the one who had left it. The slip was quiet, more a thud of pride than of pain, but loud enough to echo through the hallway. The coffee splashed across the floor like an ugly signature. His papers scattered like startled birds. Walter hit the ground with the startled exhale of a man who hadn't fallen in years. "Oh my God! I'm so sorry!" The voice was sharp, breathless. A girl in navy overalls rushed forward, rag still in hand, kneeling on the wet floor beside him. Her palms were dry, calloused from chemicals. Her hair was tied back messily, a single tendril falling across her cheek. She tried to help him up, head bowed so low he could barely see her face. Walter grunted, more annoyed at himself than at her. "It's fine," he muttered. But then something caught his eye. Not the mess, not the rag. A small notebook that had slipped from the pocket of her apron and skidded to a stop just beyond his reach. It had landed open. A breeze from the hallway vent flipped a page as if the air itself were curious. Walter reached for it, meaning only to close it, only to return it. But then he saw the first line, scribbled in pencil. If a model refuses to breathe, ask if you forced it to live in a cage. Not poetry, not exactly mathematics. Something between them. The next page was a diagram, a strange, looping sketch of spirals and arrows, variables bending around each other like dancers mid-turn. Walter froze. This looked almost identical to the stalled logic tree that had devoured half his department's funding and patience. He glanced at the girl. She was staring at the floor, hands trembling. "That's just my notes," she said quickly, as though confessing to a crime. "Nothing official." "You wrote this?" She nodded, then flinched, as if admitting it had been a mistake. "I don't know how to solve it," she whispered. "I just draw how it feels in my head." Walter closed the notebook gently, not with dismissal, but with a reverence he had not felt in years. He stood, dusted himself off, and looked at her properly for the first time. No condescension, no professor's smirk, only a scientist staring at something that defied the odds. "I'll keep this for a bit if you don't mind," he said, his voice unusually quiet. She blinked, unsure, but she nodded. And just like that, something shifted, not in the hallway, not in the air, but in the space where certainty had lived in Walter Kane's mind. That night, he did not go to his meetings. He did not respond to the department emails piling up. He sat alone in his office with the notebook open, page after page. The math wasn't formal. The symbols were inconsistent. And yet, the insight was terrifyingly beautiful. Where his team had plotted rigid lines, she had left spirals. Where they saw dead ends, she had written, "Pause here. It feels tight, like a vine forced to grow flat." By midnight, Walter felt as if he were walking through a house he had lived in for decades, only to find someone had rearranged the furniture and made it better. By 3 a.m., he reached the final page, a dense overlay of spirals and shaded arcs, annotated with one haunting line. "It doesn't need to converge. It just needs to breathe." Walter exhaled slowly. He searched the university portal. Eva Salinas, custodial staff, night shift, building K, no college enrollment, high school diploma, GED equivalent. He leaned back in his chair. For the first time in years, Walter Kane, the man who thought fate was a superstition, began to wonder if he had been looking at the board and ignoring the one who cleaned it. At dawn, he left his office. The hallways were quiet, the smell of lemon cleaner still faint in the air. And as he passed the board outside Lecture Hall C, he imagined for the first time a name scrawled there that was not a professor's. This was no longer just an unsolved problem. It was a beginning, a question larger than mathematics. What happens when brilliance wears the wrong uniform? And though Walter didn't know it yet, this hallway accident was about to set in motion the loudest whisper the department had ever heard, one that would not stop until every professor in the room had to stand up and listen. Walter Kane had not meant to read the notebook in one sitting. He told himself he would skim, just enough to know whether the patterns were clever mimicry or genuine insight. But hours passed, and the office grew darker until only the lamplight painted a small island of gold around him. He turned each page slowly, reverently. This was not the kind of work he was used to seeing from undergraduates, let alone from someone with no institutional affiliation. There were no polished theorems here, no citation chains, no tidy QED bows at the bottom. But there was something better. Motion. Every page breathed. Margins whispered to each other. Don't over-tighten here. Skip back to page 23. This part isn't wrong, just waiting. At one point, Walter caught himself smiling. Not the tired smile of a man humoring a clever amateur, but the disarmed smile of someone who had been allowed to see through a window he hadn't known was there. By the time the campus bells rang 2 o'clock, he had reached the final sketch. It was the most chaotic of them all, layers of spirals on spirals, variables coiled like galaxies in a deep sky, annotated with a line so simple it took his breath. It doesn't need to converge. It just needs to breathe. He shut the notebook, pressed his palms against its worn cover, and sat back in silence. For years, Walter had told himself that the world was fair enough. Talent rose when it was disciplined. Systems rewarded those who played by their rules. Yet here was a girl who had never been given the rule book, and still she had written an answer. Or perhaps a better question. When the sun began to lift behind the library spires, Walter stood, grabbed his coat, and made his way across campus toward Building K. The janitorial shift was nearly over. The back hallway smelled of soap and quiet fatigue. Lockers lined one side, dented and nicked with years of use. He found her there, Eva Salinas, setting her gloves to dry on the top shelf of her cart. She turned when she heard him. "Oh," she said softly, startled. "I didn't mean to. If there's another mess, I'll—" "No mess," Walter interrupted, his voice calm. He held up the notebook. For a moment her face tensed, as though bracing for reprimand. "I read it," he said simply. Her hands froze on the handle of the cart. "All of it," he added. "Oh," she whispered. "I shouldn't have kept it so long," Walter admitted, extending it toward her. "But I couldn't stop." She took it back with both hands, holding it against her chest like someone handed a folded flag. "I'd like to invite you to something," he said. She blinked. "Nothing formal. No tests, no expectations. Just come sit in on a class I'm teaching. Graduate-level applied mathematics. Lecture Hall C, Monday morning. Back row if you want. You don't have to speak, just listen." Her throat worked as if she might speak, then thought better of it. "I never went to college," she said finally. Walter nodded. "Doesn't mean you can't belong in a classroom." She hugged the notebook closer, still uncertain. "Why me?" Because, he said softly, I think your spiral is better than ours. On Monday, Lecture Hall C buzzed with the soft cadence of early semester chatter. The air smelled faintly of chalk dust and coffee. Eva slipped in through the side door just before the projector hummed to life. She wore an oversized hoodie, the sleeves pulled over her hands, her hair tied back hastily. She sat in the farthest row, clutching the notebook to her chest as if it might shield her from the room. No one noticed her, or rather no one cared to look. The students around her scribbled notes, whispered to one another, laughed at quiet jokes about problem sets. Eva's eyes tracked Walter as he stepped to the board. He did not call her name. He did not mention her presence. He simply began the lecture, lines of notation filling the board in clean strokes. Halfway through, he paused. Before we finish, he said, I'd like to leave you with a challenge. He wrote a problem on the board. No assigned reading, no expected answer. This isn't homework, Walter said, glancing at the room. This is just a question worth living with for a while. Eva stared at the symbols. Something about the framing felt rigid, unnaturally boxed. She did not raise her hand. She did not need to. Instead, she turned to a blank page of her notebook. She began to draw, not solving, not yet, just sketching the shape she felt pressing behind the equation. Spirals unfurled. She shaded parts with her fingertip, smudging charcoal gray into gradients. She murmured to herself, Don't force the loop. Let it drift. When the lecture ended and the students shuffled out, Eva stayed. Walter noticed her still there as he packed up. You stayed, he said. She nodded, eyes down. I'm not sure I understood everything. You weren't supposed to, he replied. A pause. Then he asked, Did you try the problem? She hesitated, then opened her notebook to the page she'd just filled. Walter looked down. The lines were loose but deliberate, spirals crossing like breathing diagrams, arrows pointing to places where the flow turned back on itself. At the bottom of the page, she had written, If the shape refuses to balance, maybe the balance needs a new shape. Walter's breath caught. Would you mind, he said, voice quieter now, if I showed this to someone? Eva bit her lip. I don't want to get in trouble. You won't, he promised. She nodded, closed the notebook, and handed it over. As she stood to leave, she looked back once, the faintest flicker of fear, or hope, passing over her face. Walter watched her go, the weight of the notebook in his hands heavier than any lecture he had given. He knew this was no longer just about solving a problem. It was about letting one speak. The department conference room was not meant to intimidate, and yet it always did. 6 chairs, 1 long oak table, walls lined with framed photographs of past faculty, the kind of room where silence had weight. Walter Kane sat at the head of the table, Eva's notebook resting before him like a piece of contraband. Across from him sat Dr. Vance, sharp-suited and skeptical, fingers steepled, and Dr. Kim, her gaze precise, her reputation as cutting as her proofs. You wanted us to see something, Vance said, his tone carrying just enough amusement to make it sting. Walter opened the notebook to the page Eva had drawn in Lecture Hall C. Neither professor reached for it at first. Vance finally leaned forward, scanning the spirals, the cross-hatched arcs, the tiny arrows curving like eddies in a river. These look like flower diagrams, he said at last, leaning back. Pretty, but not rigorous. Kim didn't answer. She turned a few more pages, slower, then stopped at one where Eva had marked a tight cluster with the note. Pause here. It feels like forcing a closed loop. This pattern, Kim murmured. This is the same adjustment we debated last fall. Vance's eyebrows arched. Debated and discarded, he reminded her. Kim glanced at Walter. And yet she found it? Walter nodded. She didn't just find it. She drew it before she knew we'd ever tried. Vance chuckled softly, no humor in it. You're telling me this came from the girl who mops the floors? Walter's gaze hardened. I'm telling you this came from a mind that saw what we missed. Vance pushed the notebook back across the table. It's still not proof. Intuition is not mathematics. Intuition is where mathematics begins, Walter replied evenly. Kim tapped the page with her pen. If she can translate this into formal language, it might be worth investigating further. If, Vance echoed. And until then, this is just art. Walter closed the notebook and stood. Then let's give her the chance to make it more than art. That night, Eva sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, a chipped mug of tea cooling by her elbow. The house was quiet except for the sound of her mother sewing a hem in the next room. The notebook lay open before her. She stared at the page that had sparked such debate, feeling suddenly as though she had been asked to speak a language she'd never learned. She picked up a pencil. At first, nothing came. Then she drew one line, then another, bending them into matrices, forcing her spirals into boxes they had never lived in. She worked until her hand cramped, erasing, redrawing, muttering to herself, "Don't kill it, just shape it." At dawn, she had something new, not perfect, not clean, but breathing in two dialects at once, intuition and notation. When she brought the notebook back to Walter the next afternoon, he scanned her work in silence. You reversed the loop vector, he said finally. Eva bit her lip. Because it wasn't failing forward. It was collapsing backward. Kim read it next, her brow furrowing, then smoothing. This might actually work, she said slowly. Vance crossed his arms. Or it might be an elegant accident. The question is whether she can stand behind it. Walter looked at him sharply. She already has. Not here she hasn't, Vance countered. Not in this room, not where it counts. Eva's fingers tightened on the edge of the table. What do you mean? She asked quietly. Vance leaned forward, his smile polite and cold. We're holding a colloquium next Friday. Graduate students, faculty, visiting scholars. Open floor, equal footing. If you want your name on this model, Miss Salinas, you'll have to defend it there. The word defend landed like a gavel. Eva looked from Vance to Walter, then down at her hands. I wasn't told I'd have to. You don't have to, Walter said gently. But if you do, Vance interrupted, and if you hold up under questioning, then maybe we consider including you as co-author. The room went quiet. Eva closed the notebook carefully, as if afraid it might shatter. When she left, the hallway outside felt longer than usual, the tiles colder beneath her shoes. That evening, she wandered the empty lecture hall. The board was still marked with yesterday's equations. She stood there a long time, then picked up a piece of chalk. She didn't write an answer. She drew a single spiral, small and centered, then stepped back and whispered, almost to herself, Next Friday, then. And in that whisper, something hardened, not fear, not pride, but resolve. She would not simply draw, she would stand. The kitchen table had become a battlefield. Pencils rolled like fallen soldiers, eraser dust drifted across the surface like gray snow, and page after page was covered in half-erased spirals, matrices, and notations. Eva sat hunched over the notebook, her hoodie sleeves pushed to her elbows, a single desk lamp casting a lonely cone of light on the paper. Her mother had gone to bed hours ago, leaving the apartment wrapped in quiet. Every so often, Eva would stop, stare at the page as if daring it to breathe back at her, then start again. She had never been asked to translate herself before, never been told, say it in their language if you want them to listen. The first attempts were clumsy. She forced the spirals into boxes, lined them up into column vectors until they looked lifeless. She ripped that page out. She tried again. This time, she let the matrix curves follow the arc of the spiral, not fight it. For every equation that flattened the idea, she added a note in the margin. Don't kill it. Bend it gently. By 3 a.m., her fingers were blackened with graphite. The apartment smelled faintly of burned-out pencil lead and cold tea. She turned to a fresh page, sharpened one last pencil, and began again. Line by line, she rewrote the spiral reversal. Not as art, not as pure intuition, but as formal recursion with boundary conditions annotated. She shifted the vector loop so it ran backward on itself once, then opened outward on the second pass, leaving breathing space where the closure once strangled the flow. When she put the pencil down, the page almost glowed. It was no longer just hers. It was ready to be spoken aloud. The next afternoon, the small seminar room smelled of coffee and dry marker ink. Dr. Vance sat with arms folded, his expression politely expectant. Dr. Kim leaned forward, pen poised, her interest undisguised. Walter stood at the board, chalk in hand. "Eva, whenever you're ready," he said. Eva swallowed hard, clutching her notebook. The room felt smaller than it had yesterday. She stepped forward, her sneakers scuffing the floor, and opened to the page she had finished at dawn. At first, she didn't speak. She simply drew. A single curve. Then another. A spiral growing out of the board's center. Vance cleared his throat. "We asked for formal notation," he reminded her. Eva didn't flinch. She picked up the chalk again, this time writing clean matrices along the edges of the spiral, marking transition states and loop inversions. "This is the reversal," she said softly. "You've been treating the collapse as a failure in forward flow. But it isn't failing forward, it's collapsing backward. It wants to reset the frame before moving on." Kim's pen froze midair. "That shouldn't work," Vance said flatly. "But it does," Kim murmured, standing to get a closer look. "Look, the final state isn't singular anymore. It opens here." Eva added one last line at the bottom of the board. "Boundary stays open one layer, then breathes closed." The room went still. Walter smiled faintly. "Elegant." Vance leaned back. "Pretty words. We'll see if it holds under interrogation." Eva turned toward him. "You mean the colloquium?" He nodded. "Graduate hall, full audience. You'll have to answer questions, real ones." "I didn't ask to—" "You didn't," Vance said. "But if you want your name on this, you'll stand like the rest of us." Kim shot him a look but said nothing. Walter stepped closer to Eva, his voice softer now. "You don't have to prove anything to them. But if you do, they won't be able to look away." Eva looked at the board once more, at the spirals and matrices living side by side, and felt a strange calm. "Then I'll stand," she said. Vance raised an eyebrow. "You may regret that." "Maybe," she replied, "but not as much as I'd regret staying silent." That night, after everyone left, Eva lingered alone in the seminar room. The board still bore her lines. She traced the spiral with her fingertip, smudging the chalk just enough to blur it. "Next Friday," she whispered to the empty room. And somewhere deep inside, fear folded into something sharper, resolve that could not be mopped away. The graduate hall had never been this full on a Friday afternoon. The air was electric, students whispering in the aisles, faculty settling into rows like judges waiting for the accused. The rumor had traveled faster than the official announcement. The janitor girl was going to present. Eva stood just beyond the double doors, her hoodie zipped up to her chin, notebook pressed flat against her chest. Her palms were damp. Through the crack, she saw the whiteboard already wiped clean, waiting like a challenge. Walter Kane stood beside her. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "Yes, I do," she replied. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. He smiled. "Then make them listen." When the moderator called her name, there was a ripple through the hall. Not laughter, not yet, but curiosity sharpened to a point. Eva stepped onto the stage. Her sneakers squeaked against the polished floor. She did not bring slides, no laptop, no printed proofs, just her notebook and a piece of chalk. "I was never taught how to write the perfect proof," she began, her voice soft but clear. "But I learned how to see what's missing when something's forced." A few eyebrows rose. Someone in the back coughed. She turned to the board and began to draw. A single spiral, then another, crossing the first. "This is the loop," she said, her chalk tracing the curve. "It fails here, not because it's wrong, but because we closed it too soon." She reversed the spiral, opened it outward, and added a second line running alongside like a twin river. "When we let it breathe one more layer, it resolves itself." The board filled with arcs and notations, part intuition, part formalism. Her sleeve smeared chalk across the bottom edge, but she didn't stop. "This isn't just math to me," she said, turning back to the room. "It's a way of listening, and if it looks like art, maybe that's because we forgot math was allowed to be beautiful." Silence. Then Dr. Vance stood. "Miss Salinas," he said, his tone smooth as glass, "you've given us a lovely drawing. But where is the rigor? Where is the closure?" Eva met his gaze. "Right there," she said, pointing to the open layer at the edge of the spiral. "You call that closure?" "I call it breathing room." A murmur swept the hall. Dr. Kim stood next, her eyes narrowed not in disdain, but in focus. "Show me the inversion step," she said. Eva did, flipping the chalk in her hand, sketching the loop backward, adding the matrices she had labored over at her kitchen table. Kim's brows lifted. "She reversed the vector," she said softly. "And it works," Walter added from the back of the room. The tension broke like a string pulled too tight. Someone in the audience began to clap, then another, and then the hall rose to its feet. The sound was not polite applause. It was thunder, echoing off the high ceilings, rolling down the rows like a wave. Eva stood frozen for a moment, then lowered the chalk and stepped back. Walter made his way to the board, took the marker from the tray, and in deliberate, careful strokes wrote, "Eva Salinas, Spiral Reversal Model, 2025. Not in pencil this time, in ink." When the hall finally emptied, Eva remained in the last row, notebook clutched to her chest. Walter found her there. "You shook them," he said gently. "I didn't mean to." "That's why it worked." She smiled, a small, tired smile. "So now what?" "Now," Walter said, "they can't ignore you." But not everyone applauded. That night, someone scrawled a message on the board in Lecture Hall C. "Math is not performance art." Eva stood staring at it after her shift, mop still wet in her hands. She didn't erase it. Instead, she wrote beneath it, in small block letters, "Then why do we make it wear suits?" The invitation arrived not on letterhead, but in a curt departmental email. The Faculty Oversight Committee invites Ms. Eva Salinas to a roundtable discussion on recent developments in recursive theory, attribution standards, and authorship protocol. Attendance recommended. Walter read it twice, then once more. He knew the phrasing: collegial, formal, and dangerous. "This isn't a discussion," he muttered under his breath. "It's a trial dressed up as dialogue." The round table was held in a room twice as bright and half as warm as Lecture Hall C. A single circular table sat in the middle, ringed with chairs occupied by senior faculty whose faces were carved from decades of tenure. Eva sat alone at one side, her hoodie looking suddenly too small in the sterile light. Walter took the seat beside her, his presence calm but coiled. Dr. Vance opened the meeting with a smile that never reached his eyes. "We've reviewed your spiral reversal framework," he began smoothly. "Impressive, but there are concerns." Eva's hands stayed clasped in her lap. "Concerns?" she asked softly. "It's about attribution," Dr. Kim said, her tone professional but not unkind. "Authorship, validation, precedent." Another professor leaned forward. "The problem is that if we accept this contribution without formal vetting, we set a precedent that ideas can outweigh credentials." There was a pause. Eva's voice barely rose above a whisper. "Don't they?" A few heads turned. "In theory, yes," Vance replied with the faintest of smiles. "In practice, not always. Academia runs on rigor, not intuition." Walter's jaw tightened. "She just demonstrated rigor last week." "Demonstrated performance," Vance corrected. "A clever one, yes, but one colloquium does not rewrite the peer review process." Kim glanced at Eva, then back at the table. "Perhaps we should focus on whether the model holds under replication before we—" "This isn't just about replication," Vance cut in. "It's about control of narrative." Eva felt the words like a cold hand on her neck. That night, she didn't go home. She sat in room 2F with the lights off, the board blank. Her notebook lay open in front of her. She flipped through every page, every spiral, every breath she had drawn, not for credit but because she couldn't not draw them. Now, they stared back at her like strangers. Had she trespassed? Was this still allowed to belong to her? On the last page, she wrote just one line. "Maybe I didn't solve it. Maybe I just guessed beautifully." Then she closed the notebook and left the room. 2 days later, someone taped flyers around campus. "Spiral down. Why Salinas threatens academic integrity," sponsored by the Traditional Mathematical Society. Walter tore down 3 with his own hands before noon, but by evening more had appeared. One even posted in the janitor's closet. That was the only time Eva cried. Not because it hurt, but because whoever put it there knew where to find her. That weekend, she found herself outside the old science building just before dawn, sitting on the steps with her knees pulled to her chest. When Walter arrived, he didn't speak at first. He simply sat beside her until the silence softened. "I thought if I just showed the math," Eva said finally, "it would be enough." Walter looked at her, his expression heavy. "It should be," he said quietly. "But you didn't just challenge a theorem. You challenged a hierarchy." "I didn't mean to." "I know," he replied. "That's why it worked." She looked down at her hands. "I don't think they want me here." Walter was silent for a long moment. "Then maybe," he said at last, "you're exactly where you're supposed to be." That night, she returned to Lecture Hall C. The board had been wiped clean, but someone had left a bright red marker on the tray, uncapped. Eva picked it up slowly, and for the first time she didn't draw. She wrote in letters steady and deliberate, "A spiral has no hierarchy, only flow." Then she set the marker down, cap off, as if inviting the next hand to write, and walked away. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy enough to feel expensive. It waited for her on the top shelf of the custodial closet, tucked beneath a stack of clean rags. Eva turned it over twice before opening it. Inside, an official letter, embossed with the crest of the Halliard Fellowship for Emerging Mathematical Thought, a program so selective that entire graduating classes of graduate students had applied and failed. She read the first line 3 times. "We are pleased to inform you that you have been selected as the inaugural recipient of the Halliard Fellowship." Her breath caught. The stipend was generous enough to cover years of rent, tuition waivers, guaranteed housing, a research assistantship. But halfway down the second page, she saw it, the quiet clause written in polished legal language. In order to maintain the neutrality of the fellowship, recipients agree to refrain from affiliations with unsanctioned research groups or public advocacy projects that may compromise institutional credibility. Eva felt her throat tighten. She folded the letter once, then again, then tucked it back into the envelope. That evening, she carried the letter to Walter's office. He read it in silence, his eyes narrowing at the clause. "They want you," he said at last. "Not all of me," she replied quietly. Walter placed the letter back on his desk. "This is a door," he said. "But it sounds like they want you to lock the one you just built for others." Eva looked down at her hands. "If I take it, I lose the collective. If I refuse, I might lose everything else." Walter didn't speak for a long moment. "Whatever you choose," he said finally, "make sure it's your choice, not theirs." That night, Eva sat at the kitchen table while her mother folded towels. "They finally saw your mind," Maria said softly after reading the letter. "They want me to leave the spiral behind," Eva said. "Leave Walter's lab. Leave what we started." Maria set the letter down and looked at her daughter. "When people say we want you," she said gently, "sometimes they mean, but not all of you." Eva swallowed hard. "What would you do?" "I used to think safety was better than wholeness," Maria said. "But safety doesn't last. Wholeness does." On Wednesday morning, Eva walked into the math department's main office, the letter in hand. The secretary looked up, startled. "I need to speak with the fellowship committee chair," Eva said. A short meeting was arranged for the next day. The man waiting inside the glass-walled conference room wore a blazer too crisp to be from this zip code. "Miss Salinas," he said warmly, "we're thrilled about your potential. Let's discuss your trajectory." Eva placed the letter on the table, folded neatly. "Thank you for the offer," she said, voice steady. "But I won't be accepting." The chair blinked. "Is this about the affiliation clause?" "I assure you it's standard." "I'm not standard," Eva said softly. He leaned back, studying her as though she were a puzzle piece that refused to fit. "You're walking away from a guaranteed future." Eva smiled a little, though it ached. "No," she said. "I'm staying where the math lives." That evening, when Walter found her outside the lecture hall, she was sitting on the steps, hoodie pulled tight against the wind. "You said no," he guessed. She nodded. He didn't hide his pride. "Then we build something better," he said. But when she returned to her shift that night, she noticed the custodial schedule pinned to the wall had been wiped clean beside her name. Someone had erased her. Walter saw it too the next morning. He took out a red pen and wrote it back in. "Eva. No shift assigned. Just Eva. No title. No time slot. Just a name, because the building deserved to remember." That night, Eva stayed late in room 2F. She flipped to the last page of her notebook and wrote one word in the center, big and dark enough to press through the paper: integrity. Then she closed the notebook, set her pencil beside it, and let out a long, steady breath. The choice had been made, and now the consequences would come. For 13 days, Eva Salinas disappeared. No emails, no notebook on Walter's desk, no sound of the mop bucket's wheels at the end of the hall. Even her locker stayed locked, a faint layer of dust collecting on the metal like a thin veil. At first, the department moved on. Meetings were still held, drafts still circulated, but a strange unease settled over the building. Students lowered their voices in lecture halls. Professors paused longer than usual before uncapping markers, as though waiting for someone who never arrived. Even the air in Lecture Hall C felt emptier. Walter Kane kept walking the halls after hours. He told himself it was to check on the lab, but his feet always carried him past the janitor's closet, past the vending machines, past the lecture hall where Eva had stood with her chalk like a blade. Each night the building was silent, until the night that wasn't. At 2:07 a.m. on the 14th night, Walter turned the corner and saw light spilling from under the door of Lecture Hall C. The room wasn't on the schedule. His pulse quickened. He tried the handle. It turned easily, cold against his palm. Inside, the room was empty. No Eva, no students, just the faint smell of pencil lead and the hum of the fluorescent lights. And there, on the central table, lay a single notebook. Thicker than the one he'd first seen, its spine was reinforced with cloth tape. In the corner of the cover, written in careful block letters, "Final Draft." Walter sat down slowly. For a long moment he did not open it. He simply rested his hand on the cover, as though it might still be warm. Then, with fingers that trembled more than he would have admitted, he turned the first page. It was not just notes, it was a map. Page after page, Eva had traced the evolution of the spiral reversal method. Every failed attempt circled, every correction annotated with quiet clarity. Don't tighten here. Let it breathe. This part isn't wrong. Just waiting. Each section flowed into the next, like chapters of a book. Some pages were smudged with graphite, others damp at the edges as though from tears. By page 10, Walter found himself whispering under his breath, not out of disbelief, but reverence. By page 22, he was pacing the front of the room, gripping the notebook like scripture. And by page 36, he stopped, pressed his hand flat against the table, and laughed. A quiet, broken laugh that startled even him. She had done it, finished it. Not just a sketch, not just a question, but a full recursive framework, written in a language that was neither purely theirs nor purely hers, but something entirely new. At the very end of the notebook, one last page, in pencil, barely darker than the paper itself. If you are reading this, thank you for letting me stay long enough to see the pattern through, and beneath that, a single line, underlined once. It never belonged to me. I just listened when it knocked. Walter closed the notebook, placed both hands on its cover, and let the silence fill the room. Then he stood, walked to the board, and in large block letters wrote 3 words. She was right. For the first time in weeks, the hall no longer felt hollow. By noon the next day, scanned copies of the notebook had already reached colleagues in Berlin, Kyoto, and Boston. Each replied with the same sentence, "Who is she?" Walter replied with 2 words, "Eva Salinas." And for the first time since she vanished, he smiled. Because even in her absence, she was no longer invisible. The annual Mathematics and Theoretical Systems Conference was not a place for amateurs. Banners hung from the high ceiling like flags of a citadel, announcing names that had shaped entire subfields. The room buzzed with accents from 5 continents, badges glinting under the bright lights. Walter Kane sat 3 rows from the front, shoulders tight. His name was not on the program, but another was Dr. Julian Kessler, one of the earliest skeptics of Eva's spiral reversal. When the projector lit up, Walter's stomach sank. Spiral recursions in adaptive modeling, a framework proposal. The first slide looked too familiar. So did the diagram, a softly arching spiral rendered in clean mathematical overlay. Eva's spiral, polished, sterilized, stripped of her name. Kessler spoke with rehearsed ease. While exploratory structures existed previously, our lab formulated the first formal structure to resolve the asymmetry problem. Walter's hand gripped his pen so hard it cracked. On the 6th slide, Kessler drew the spiral freehand on the whiteboard, added notations, directional flows, limit behaviors. Then he turned to the audience with a smile. As you can see, this framework resolves the non-convergence paradox our department faced for years. Applause stirred faintly. Walter stood. He didn't raise his hand, didn't wait for permission. That spiral, he said, his voice clear and steady, does not belong to this department. Heads turned. Kessler blinked. It belongs, Walter continued, to a janitor. Her name is Eva Salinas. A ripple of gasps broke the air. A few faculty exchanged glances. Someone at the back muttered, "Is he serious?" "Do you have proof?" a voice called. Walter lifted a notebook high. Every page dated. Every line drawn by her hand, including the part your model copies without understanding. Kessler's smile thinned. "Professor Kane, this is hardly the venue." "Then when is the venue?" Walter shot back. "When do we decide that truth matters more than affiliation? When do we credit insight over institution?" The moderator hesitated, looking rattled. And then the side door opened. A figure stepped in quietly, hair pulled back, hoodie and worn jeans, a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Eva. The room held its breath. She walked down the aisle, each step deliberate, as if crossing some invisible line she had once been told not to cross. Walter did not turn. He didn't need to. Eva reached the whiteboard, notebook clutched to her chest. She looked at Kessler. "I believe you drew this part wrong," she said softly. Before anyone could speak, she wiped away the rightmost curve with her fingertip. Chalk dust smeared across her hand. Then, with calm precision, she took a marker from her bag and drew a new arc, smoother, more elegant. She added a counter spiral to balance the recursion, each curve breathing into the next. When she finished, she turned to the audience. "This is the correct model," she said simply. Then, at the bottom of the board, she wrote in bold letters, "Eva Spiral Method, Open Source," and underlined it once. No one moved. Then, slowly, a professor from MIT stood and began to clap. Then another. And then the room rose to its feet. The applause was not polite. It was thunder, a recognition that felt almost like absolution. Kessler quietly gathered his papers and left the stage. No one stopped him. Later, in the hallway, Walter found Eva near the vending machine, the same spot where she had once stood during her very first class. "You didn't have to come," he said. "Yes," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. "I did." He nodded, almost smiling. "Why?" Eva shrugged. "Because it was mine, and because I wanted to give it away on my own terms." Walter reached into his satchel and pulled out a folded flyer. "The Research Collective," he said. Eva took it, glanced at it once, then tucked it into her bag. "I'll think about it," she said. "No rush," Walter replied. "But you should know. Somewhere in 5 countries right now, your spiral is already being studied with your name on it. Eva lowered her eyes, but a small smile touched her lips. They finally saw me, she whispered. No, Walter said softly. They finally saw what you always were. That night, someone returned to Lecture Hall C and wrote on the door, Eva Spiral Theorem, Salinas Kane Model. No one erased it again, not ever. The letter was printed on ivory paper so thick it whispered when folded. The return address, International Institute for Theoretical Discovery, Geneva, Switzerland. Eva held it for hours before she opened it. Inside, we are honored to inform you that the inaugural recipient of the Breakthrough Contribution Award by a non-affiliated thinker is Ms. Eva Salinas for the development of the spiral reversal framework. This honor recognizes brilliance not born of title but of vision, and the courage to share it. Her chest tightened. Her hands trembled. At the bottom, one last line. Would you be willing to speak? 1 week later, Geneva was gray and beautiful. The grand hall stood like a cathedral of glass and steel. Inside, hundreds of mathematicians, scientists, journalists, and dignitaries filled the seats, badges gleaming like medals. Walter sat quietly in the 3rd row, refusing the Institute's offer to seat him closer. He said he came not to be honored, but to watch a name become real. Backstage, Eva stood in a simple dark gray dress her mother had insisted she borrow. Her calloused hands smoothed the hem nervously. When the announcer spoke her name, from no department, no university, no one's permission, the hall erupted in applause. Eva walked onto the stage, the glass plaque glinting under the lights. She paused at the podium, looked out at the sea of suits and notebooks, pens poised to capture her words. When she spoke, her voice was steady. When I was 19, I scrubbed a floor so someone else could see the board better. I never thought I'd be standing on one. A ripple of soft laughter. Silence followed. My first equations were drawn in pencil, on delivery forms in a janitor's closet. I didn't know words like recursive modeling. I just knew a shape that wouldn't leave my head until I drew it. And when I showed it to others, some said it wasn't real. That intuition isn't math. That I didn't belong. She took a slow breath. Maybe they were right. I didn't belong in the halls that mocked my uniform, but I belonged to the spiral, to the shape that kept knocking on my mind until I answered. Her voice softened, but carried through the hall. So today, I accept this, not because I earned it more than anyone else, but because I didn't erase myself before someone else could. And if there is someone out there right now with a spiral in their mind, with no one to listen, this is for you. You are not invisible. You are not unqualified. You are unclaimed brilliance. The silence afterward was long and reverent. Then the hall rose to its feet. Walter stood too, hand over heart, his eyes shining. That night, while the reception buzzed with champagne and polite conversations, Eva slipped away to a quiet gallery at the far end of the hall. Under soft light, mounted on the wall, was the official publication, The Spiral Reversal Method, Salinas Kane Model. Beneath it, in gold letters, Eva Salinas, Independent Contributor, recognized for changing the direction of inquiry. Walter found her standing there, still as a statue. He handed her a pen, not just any pen, but his red fountain pen, the one he used only for final drafts and names that mattered. Want to sign it? He asked. She hesitated. It's already printed. Then sign it anyway, Walter said softly. This time, in ink. Eva uncapped the pen. Her hand didn't shake. She wrote her name slowly, underlining it once, and next to it, smaller, for the ones who were never asked. Weeks later, back at the university, Lecture Hall C was no longer silent at night. At 2:00 a.m., students gathered with notebooks and questions, writing freely on the board. No schedule, no permission slip, just possibility. And on the far corner of the whiteboard, someone had redrawn the original spiral, a little messy, a little off-center, but alive. Beneath it, in small, steady letters, "The door is open. Bring your own question." Outside, Eva walked past the window, saw the light spilling onto the quad. She smiled, not because she had been seen, but because the spiral had outgrown her, and would keep breathing long after she was gone. Thank you for staying with this story until the very last moment. If some part of Eva's journey spoke to you, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Every subscribe is a quiet reminder that stories like this deserve to be told. If you'd like to hear more journeys like this, hit subscribe and turn on the bell, so when the next story begins, you'll be the first to hear it. And if you're holding a spiral of your own, don't erase it. Keep drawing.